of co-creating value. Dr. Griffin is the professor of business ethics and strategy at Loyola University School of Business. She's an award-winning educator and frequently requested speaker that leads corporate strategy, social impact, and strategy-oriented CSR workshops for executives worldwide. Her research is published in multiple disciplines. In addition to the numerous research awards and grants she has won, her book, Managing Corporate Impacts, Co-Creating Value, won the Academy Management 2017 Book Award. And Managing Impacts, Co-Creating Value is the book we'll be discussing today. So thrilled to be here with you, and Jen, so thrilled to be discussing with you as well.
All right. Thank you, Lindsay. It's so great to see you and Seth and so many others that I've had either in class or had the opportunity to work with over the last few years here in Chicago. So I have this book that was written in 2016, 5 years ago. And you might say, okay, why is that relevant? And we still might be a question at the end of it, but let me start with a thought experiment. So the idea is corporate impacts. And so when you think about corporates or corporations, what do you think about? Say it out loud, pop it in the chat to Lindsay, but what do you think about when you think about corporates?
Big business.
Multinational businesses?
Yeah, I see money, banks, impersonal.
So nameless, faceless, sort of
Shareholders.
others. Global reach, but it's the big corporates. And now, before you go on, Lindsay, beholden to shareholders. All right. Lindsay, if you will capture some of those ideas, because I have another thought experiment for you. What do you mean, or what do you think of? What's the first thing you think of when you hear impacts, in particularly corporate impacts?
Numbers.
That still might be about the corporate,
Oh,
but
yeah.
what's the impacts? Financial numbers then, employment perhaps numbers.
Profit.
That's the impact. So it's financially based.
Social, environmental.
And environmental. Social, Amy, being what? What does social mean? Environment we can sort of understand, but what does society mean then, particularly for a corporate impact? Does it come down to the local community? Does it come down to the neighborhood? Does it come down to the individual? Or is it the more generic sort of out there? All right.
Living wages, influence on social norms. Yep, go ahead, William.
Yeah, a lot of jobs, maybe
Jobs.
jobs.
All right.
So,
but keep putting that into, thank you, Jill, marketing slogan. All right, so keep sending that to Lindsay and she'll keep collecting that, because part of what I do with the book, and this was 5 years ago, and it was written because I was talking with so many different executives from so many different continents. So for 15 years, except for last year with COVID, I was in Australia every year, London for 5 or 6 years to have the different conversations. University of Chile was 12 years. But in talking with these different India, Lebanon, US, but lots of different executives, and we were talking about corporate impacts. And what was most amazing to me is we had to unpack what's the idea of corporations. So is it the cities? Is it the urban areas? Is it the brand names that you might see here? Next slide, Lindsay. Or is it, and this is from my walk in River North, is it walking by the Binnies or the Cozies? Devon Bank is a little bit of a stretch, but David Laudy, I just had to give him a shout out. On Grand Avenue, is it D'Amatos? These are all family businesses, by the way. Next slide. And so when you think about corporations and you're thinking about managing impacts, do you think about family businesses? They are, like I said, Bill and William, you might be the ringers here, 83.3 million people in the US. More than half of the private sector workforce, significant contributor to the GDP, $7.7 trillion. And yes, they suffered 60% had no change in jobs though, and able to keep all employees. And this comes from a recent survey from Family Business Enterprises, as well as Torsten Pieper from UNC Charlotte. Next slide. Similarly, when you start to think about impacts and you start to unpack the idea of what does impacts, and particularly corporate impact, it is about numbers, it is about profits, it is about finances and profit maximization. So it's for the owners, for the shareholders. Now, and so for family businesses, the owners might be the family. But for lots of the generic view of corporations, it's these nameless, faceless, sort of stock market, publicly traded organizations. And then perhaps it's about philanthropy. It's about a giveaway, which is incredibly important. But I've got the statistics from individuals, foundations, and nonprofits. And corporate philanthropy is actually at the bottom. It's about 6%. Individuals are about 80%, especially if you include bequeaths. But the foundations have significant, it's about 20% there. But the next slide, Lindsay. But impacts are also about, thank you, William and Bill, about employees. It's about living wages. I think that was Amy that said that. So as these different ideas about how individuals and employees are impacted, whether it's Black Lives Matters, DEI, education and tuition remission or tuition loan reimbursements or forgiveness. Is it about full-time workers? Is it about contingent workers or FTEs or contractors? Is it about the Uberization? So you can see there's a lot of issues even tied into or underneath that one thread if you pull corporate impacts just on the employee side. Next slide, Lindsay. But what about the impacts of the products and services themselves? Either how they are manufactured, how they are used or consumed, and then come back with a circular economy, or how they are sourced in the procurement side. So if you think just about products and services, fast-moving consumer goods, the brand and branded companies with their brand promise are the ones that you might think are most sensitive to social impacts. Or you might look at how things are sourced and is it ethical sourcing? So a lot of the ideas now, particularly in Switzerland with the laws, are about human trafficking. And do you know, not just tier 1, but tier 2, tier 3 suppliers and how they might be affecting your ability to compete, or even the global supply chain, as we saw with Suez Canal just in the recent past. But does that mean that lawyers or consultancy or knowledge-based workers that don't have widgets, don't have products, but really are service-based, what's their impact? Their impact is probably far more on knowledge or information-based. And so, as well as the B2B companies. And so the idea of corporates, let's unpack that to be you and I and the smaller and larger businesses, but let's also start unpacking the idea of impacts. And so those impacts are the points of intersection between an organization and anyone else. Next one and last one, Lindsay. And so as we were, and this is where I was asking you to unpack the idea of community or social. Does it get down to the neighborhood? Is it more about government? Is it more about permits and zoning? So it's about growth. And so if it is about permits and zoning and growth, then how is it, you know, then it becomes really critical to innovation. It becomes really critical to the future of the organization. Is it about how the organization is perceived in the media? Is it about rivals and being a thought leader or an action leader, not just a thought leader? Is it more about perceptions? Not just the image that the organization extends out, but the reputation of outside back in. And then at the bottom and at the end of it all, is it really about building trust and trust with these different stakeholders? And so the point of the book, next slide, is that each of these different types of impacts are relevant in different ways to different organizations. So if, and the title of the book is about managing corporate impacts, if we are to manage them as executives, then how is it that we combine these and integrate these more holistically? So it's not individual issues, but how is it that they bundle together, coalesce, and create a desired impact by the organizations? So often when organizations have some sort of financial impact, it goes to the finance department, it goes to investor relations, it goes to the board of advisors of the board of directors. It might be creating a foundation of philanthropy. If it's about employees, it goes to HR. Maybe it's EH&S. Procurement, supply chain ops, they're on the docket when it's about products and services. Alternatively, it is siloed in community relations, government relations, PA, PR, if it is about outside or externally focused, boundary spanning sort of ideas. But what if, rather than individual functional silos, what if they were integrated? What if we looked at the whole organization and bringing the entire organization to bear on relevant impact, not issues, not stakeholders, but combine that sweet spot between issues and stakeholders and really focus on impacts, moving that needle, that it would be interdisciplinary, that it really looks at the underlying lifeblood of the organization, not just the mission, vision, values, which is the rhetoric often, not always. Family businesses, you're always on the outlier on that one, but it's not just, you know, what's posted on the wall, but it's also what the actions and the decisions are every day, regardless of if it's in headquarters or far-flung subsidiaries or even the next community over. But what if we were to embed these ideas rather than bolt it on? What if these issues were not just one-off, but actually part of us as managers to actually consider of doing good and doing well? And this is where the business ethics side of me and the strategy professor side of me dovetail, because I do believe in doing good and doing well. So I focus on the ampersand and pulling out the friction of that. Next slide. So what if these different issues that have come up, even in the last 5 years from when the book was published, what if we were to take these issues and combine them selectively, creatively, identify what your organization is going to do and interweave it then throughout the entire organization, top down, left to right? But starting to look at where the material impacts are of the organization, of its products, through its hiring and training and retention strategy. But it's starting to look at the why, what, and how. Because often when it comes to corporate impacts or CSR, we focus on what the organization does. And then how does it give evidence? And it backs into the why is this important? And family businesses are different, so I'll talk about them separately. But that why, what, how triplet is really important. But if to multiply it, how do you extend it then to where, when, and whom? And that's, there's 3 literal parts to the book. There's the why, what, how. It's unpacking the myths. And then how do you multiply the good and the impact through the where, when, whom. And I'm only going to get really to the first bit about the why, what, how. But next slide, Lindsay. So what if you were to reimagine? These different pressures are not one-off. So this comes literally from 2020 and 2021, and we're going to share the slide deck. But there's 40.5 trillion with a T dollars invested in ESG, 51 billion net new money in ESG, 400 new sustainable funds. This comes from Morningstar. This comes from pensions and investments. Illinois has its board diversity role from 2019. You've got all the activity over the last 12 months, but actually over the last 120 years about employment and dignity and respect for individuals under and unemployed, as well as who is and who are the essential workers, and how then you might reconfigure your business given COVID to double down on the essential workers. You've got consumer pressures, 79% change in consumer preferences towards social and environmental activities. That comes from Ernst & Young. Well, Ernst & Young has an affordability and purpose dynamic. But what if it was to co-create and start to integrate selectively these ideas? Next slide, Lindsay. And so it's managing multiple impacts simultaneously. So it's not one-offs and it's not siloed into disciplines as it is taught in the B school, but how is it from the bird's eye C-suite or board of directors, as well as those that are entering? You look at the economic and the workers, as well as the products and services, and some of the intended as well as unintended impacts in society and communities, whether it's through partnering and CSOs or business clusters. Next slide. And some might say, this is just old wine in a new bottle, because it's 2019. And so my 16 book is, I'm just preaching to the choir now. But I'd submit, click the next button, Lindsay. 15 years ago, Muhammad Yunus received the Nobel Peace Prize because business is a beautiful mechanism to solve problems. And so that refocus on money or profits or owners rather than solving problems or employing people or being long-lived. Next one, Lindsay. And 15 years before that, 30 years ago, 1990, this is Business Roundtable again, is talking about on the very bottom, under the laws of the various states to pursue economic and activities that are intended to benefit both the shareholders and society as a whole. This is not a new idea, but what is new is to purposefully, intendedly, not just have it as window dressing, not just as greenwashing or blue washing or purple washing is what I've heard, but how is it that we meaningfully pull this in? Next slide, Lindsay. And so you might imagine that different organizations have different journeys. And Seth has talked about this in a couple of different forums, but it's also in the book. So I'm just including his slide here. But is it compliance with the law? Yeah, absolutely. Start with that just as a below the line hygiene factor. But in some countries, and there's research to suggest that compliance with the law gets you a gold star. But can we actually aim for something greater than that? And so there's the philanthropy or the goodwill. And a lot of people might consider that altruistic or individual, not organizational, or they set up separate corporations or corporate foundations for that. Another way in which people might enter this is through integration. And this often comes from where an organization was last, for lack of a better term, smacked upside the head. So if it was HR and employees, it's going to be integration through HR. It might be through supply chain or procurement. It might be through branding. It might be through government relations. But that quite literally is where this is housed, again, within asylum, perhaps reporting through HR, perhaps reporting through legal or compliance. But another way to think about it is how is it that you purposefully, meaningfully integrate each of the different types of impacts? And I'm not saying all of them all the time. I'm just saying selectively, creatively, identify where the material impacts are and what the organization wants to do so that you can have that coherent triplet of what are we doing, how are we giving evidence every day, everywhere, and why do we double down on this? Whether it's for money or for an investment or because it's the right thing to do or because it's a founder legacy idea. But having that why, what, how solidifies. All right. Couple more slides. Next, Lindsay. And so I said that there are 3 parts to the book. There was looking at the impacts and unpacking what impacts might mean, especially for large and small businesses. Second part is myths. And I'm just going to have this one slide on myths. Size matters. And I would unpack that entirely, that every individual and every individual organization, regardless of size, can look at how it employs, how it hires, how it trains, how it retains, how it treats its direct employees, let alone its indirect or contingent employees, as well as the products that it puts out the doors. Resources matters. There's monetary resources, but let's unpack what resources are. Resources are technology. Resources are networks and relationships. And so how is it that you can expand that word of what resources mean? Not my problem, one of my favorite, and this always comes up in almost every conversation. Well, it's not my problem, it's the government problem. It's not my problem, it's a community association problem. It's not my problem, it's the neighborhood, it's someone else's problem. And unpacking that of, okay, maybe the whole entirety of the issue or the impact is not your problem, but what can you do to be part of the solution? What can you do to not be complicit? What can you do to be that outlier? And there's loads of, William? And then the zero-sum game is that it's a trade-off. That's the economist speaking. Let's just get the pricing right and then all will be well. And I unpack that as well. William?
I didn't raise my hand. You want me to say something?
It sounded like you had unmiked yourself. And so I'm just used to people interrupting and pushing back and saying, hey, wait a second, Jen. So I'm completely open to that. Lindsay's taking your questions too, I know, through chat. So if you have questions or comments or any of this, I'm going to finish up in about another 2 minutes, and it is wide open for whatever conversation we want. So William, do you have a question now?
Not right now. Thanks.
All right. There'll be more. Hold on. And so this is the myth side of things. And particularly there's 3 myths: the rhetoric and the reality, the credibility, and then the impatience.
Hey. Oh,
Ivy, did you have a question?
no,
All right. Next slide.
no, I'm sorry.
No worries, Ivy. It's great to see you again. Next slide.
Yep.
All right. So this is another one of those myths. And this is where I come at the ampersand. So the myth is that it's profits or impacts, that there's always that trade-off between the two. And this is some of the research that I am best known for. That is more than 20 years. I've won other awards for this sort of research and have just developed it. Started this actually with a good mentor of mine as a dissertation student years ago, decades ago. But this also helped when I was working at GE. I wish I had this insight when I was talking to my boss's boss even longer ago. But the point here being is that you've got profits for owners and shareholders, for those nameless, faceless others, publicly traded. So there's benefits and harms to those owners, and that makes the decision really simple, black and white. You know, it's if it benefits, that's great. If it harms, then you don't want to do it. So it becomes a win-win. If you add in others, any other than shareholders, any other stakeholder, employees, consumers, community, any other type of impact, where do you want to be? Next slide. You want to be in the win-win. That's easy. You can articulate that. That's not a problem. But where are most people? Next slide. Nope. Most people are in the parade of horribles because CSR impacts is a back foot, pear-shaped, you're already behind and defensive argument. But where do I want you to be, and where do I go into organizations? This is the one, Lindsay. This is my favorite quadrant. This is about where 80% of the organizations are. Because the owners do not have a return of some sort, what is of value at some point, but someone else benefits. Employees love you, are loyal, want to be there. Consumers want your products, can't get enough of it. Community, you're a good citizen. This quadrant, next slide, is by definition a cost center. It's an expense, but it's also an investment. If you are investing in something to get to the win-win-win, or if you're investing in something to stop from being part of that parade of horribles. And so that's one of the biggest insights when I go in and talk to any organization, is when they talk about any of these what's, any of these activities, any of these impacts, do they talk about it as an investment in their people, in their investment in their organization, as an investment into their future, as an investment into growth? Or, oh, we have to do this. Yeah, this is about compliance. This is yesteryear thinking. Next slide. So that's getting to the ampersand. So those are some of the myths and unpacking those myths and getting to the ampersand. And how is it that you can selectively, creatively combine what seemingly is a trade-off, and what the economists will tell you is a trade-off between profits and purpose. And then this is just the one slide on multipliers. We talk about this and we go greater into depth in classes and other forums. But this is an entire other class. But what you promised yesterday and what you're doing today and how that extends to tomorrow and your ability to create value tomorrow, because strategy is about creating tomorrow and leaving organizations for the next generation, perhaps. But how is it that you connect today with yesterday, but more importantly, today with tomorrow? That's the timing multiplier. And then the multiple geographies or the multiple communities, what you're doing at headquarters. Are you also doing that at your manufacturing sites? Are you doing that at your retail sites? How is it that you are connecting different communities or commitments to communities? That's the geography. What you say and what you do, are you doing it throughout the entire organization? Or is the US sort of held off separate from Mexico or Canada? Or is there learning then, even from the global south to the north? And then the third multiplier is what you say to your customers. Is it the same as what you expect from your tier 1, 2, and 3 suppliers? So are you connecting with a circular economy, for example, the entire value chain? And those are the multipliers. So once you get past the why, what, how, the 3 multipliers of is this for real within an organization is often tested through timing, geographies, and the value chain. And that's the dynamic aspect of it. Next one. And so to steal from, this is one of the cases that we do in class, but Tony's choke lonely. It's creating awareness and being aware of an issue or an impact or desiring to create an impact is perhaps the start of the journey. And then the organization wants to lead by example. But the final with the multipliers is really about inspiring others. And how is it that you inspire others, whether it's your employees, whether it's suppliers, whether it's even your rivals or other new businesses, to make the impossible possible? And that's where the multiplicity of the impacts creates this tacit sort of space that is uniquely yours as an organization. Last slide. And so all I'd like to do is just thank you, open it up to questions, anything that's on your mind. Lindsay, it's all to you, and I'm glad to answer whatever questions you might have.
Thank you, Jen. So yeah, just to remind everyone, please feel free to ping me any questions you might have. I can raise them to Jen, or if you'd like to jump in, you are more than welcome to. We want to make this a dynamic discussion that answers any questions you guys have on this topic. Jen, I'd like to kick it off by asking about, this last year, right? As we all are aware, COVID-19, the reckoning with racial justice in the US, all the different, natural disasters and other, crazy things that happened over the course of the last year or 18 months. How do you think companies can leverage this value model in which to help navigate those current event type issues that come up?
These are not one-off issues. These are systemic. And these are things that need to be looked at more holistically. Yes, there are immediate responses that need to occur, but how is it that it is not just a token or a symbolic sort of shareholders and society, as might have happened back in 1990 with Business Roundtable, but actually embed it. And so it's the talk and the walk. So it's not just the thinking, it's not just the talking, it's the action, but how is it that it is purposefully mutually reinforcing to drive change forward, even in the smallest change possible within your own sphere of influence as an individual manager, as an employee at the lowest level, even as an owner within an organization. So those little bits, let 1,000 flowers. So here, when a tree falls in the forest, do you listen and talk about the tree that falls or the 1,000 trees that are growing? And so it is that focus on the many little things, but purposefully, meaningfully, intendedly connecting them. And that's where the racial injustices are real. And how then can every organization do its bit to be part of the solution?
Absolutely. I was wondering if you could speak to a little further about maybe how to capture that the value in that investment. You talked about this being a cost center, right? Or being viewed as a cost center from those who maybe not have been bought into this model. Can you speak to maybe those that are interested in coming back to their businesses to make further change in this direction and how they can quote unquote sell the investment?
Well, in part, if it's a cost center and if it's about compliance driven, it's generally about what we were doing yesterday, or is looking at the legal, ethical side of things. But if you're looking to tomorrow and you're looking to growth and you're looking to how is it that we can build together, that's more the investment. The investment is really about future looking rather than compliance or backward looking. And in part, compliance comes by because of public policy, and public policy comes, former institution, this is what I also taught and what I'm fairly well known for, is regulation. And regulation always is a market failure. Regulations are because someone or some set of organizations did not do what was expected by the people, by the populace. And so that's already back behind the curve. You're not getting ahead of the issues. And so if racial injustices and the employees are speaking, getting ahead of the curve is in business's best interest every single time. But it's how is it that individually, but also collectively, organizations can think about that growth. And so that's one of the huge hurdles I have found in speaking with executives and working with executives around the world, is looking at not just corporate or not just compliance or government regulation as the ceiling, as the goal, but as the floor. And how is it then that we can be beyond compliance and selectively be beyond compliance, and things that we as an organization are so good at that no one else can either replicate or compete with. And so it becomes a competitive advantage.
Absolutely. Carolyn asked a great follow-up question. She asked, how do we address and move from that zero-sum mentality?
It's hard. It's crazy hard. So choose wisely and be careful with what you choose, because not everything can be picked apart to get to that third way. So zero sum, by definition, is someone wins, someone loses. Is there a way that you can creatively pull together a win-win? So for example, unfunded mandates or unpaid interns, for example. DC, Chicago entrepreneurs, they need unfunded or they need unpaid interns. Universities have those interns. Is there a way to fund those interns through a different funding mechanism so that the students and the entrepreneurs, the students get the experience, the entrepreneurs get the unpaid interns, but there's a funding mechanism that allows for the interns to get paid? And maybe that comes through a board of directors, maybe that comes from a different foundation from the university. But that's just one of the more recent examples of when I was talking to someone about how is it that we can selectively find a more creative way to get cheap labor, but good labor, good experience. I still am all for a living wage, but also expand the pool, because the people that are mostly able to do unpaid interns might not be the ones that really need the job and need the experience and need the mentorship. So find different funding mechanisms.
Mary, did you want to jump in with your question? Happy to read it as well. So Mary said, while the corporate point of view may B, on holistic impacts. They often work with individual nonprofits to help them achieve positive social impacts. But
Right.
nonprofits can't address all impacts. So how do we as a nonprofit engagement managers make the case for mutually beneficial partnerships?
All right, and that's one of the beauties of both the Baumhart Scholars and the different conversations, is that learning how to approach organizations, where are they A, most vulnerable, and where B, you as a nonprofit can help support them where they are vulnerable. So find which organizations might be most vulnerable to attacks with the service or the opportunity that you have. And then how is it that you become part of the solution in concert with them? And it actually becomes pretty creative that you see different organizations combine together to collaborate. So United Way of Chicago has a lot of work with Women's ETF Fund. And Jill, you can expand on this more. But how is it then that we can empower women by working with United Way? And so it's different ways of thinking about it. So how are you part of the solution for the organization? Is in part, I think, what I'm saying, Amy. Does that help? Or is that Mary?
Mary, yeah. And everyone, feel free to chime in with follow-up questions if there's anything you'd like to Jen to add on, or other questions. Okay. So
William?
question. Oh,
Jen, can I ask? I mean, you've written this book some time ago, and there's been a lot of change, and you've described that change. I'm curious, what surprised you the most in terms of the kind of, book species that have, kind of over the last 4 years been really borne out in some way? And then on the other hand, this is a challenging question, I know, after you put your heart and soul into the book, but, was there anything that you look back at the book and say, I'd write that differently today?
Oh, yeah, just about every word I would write differently, because this was intendedly a book towards research to put different ideas. So let me take the second question first. I would make it far more user-friendly. And please don't buy the book. There's no need to buy the book. I'm glad to have conversations with individual organizations or even groups to look at impacts and corporate impacts so that they're meaningful. But what surprised me most is a lot of organizations get that there's multiple impacts. And especially in Australia, it being a small island country, they're one person that wears multiple hats. And so they're working with HR and employees, they're working with product and procurement, they're working with community relations, whether it's a mining company or whether it's banks or whatever it might be. And so they think that they are doing all the different impacts and they think that they are combining it, but they're still, to use that technical term, smacked upside the head, because it is at the entry level, it's at the neighborhood level that those integration is occurring. It is not deeply embedded within the organization and really taking it up to the C-suite. And the C-suite then isn't understanding that this isn't a one-off. And that's the difference, that it's really a strategic organization-wide, bringing the entire organization to bear on some of these problems. Because at the ground level, there's a lot of organizations, a lot of individuals that are putting heart and soul and shoulder to, grindstone and making those impacts and making that difference, but it's not getting filtered back up. And it's that filtering up, bringing back down that is really important. Use an example recently, I don't want to name names, but a company was being affected by one of its acquisitions in Indonesia. And so why is it that we need to source palm oil? And why is it that we need to ethically source palm oil? Because, that's in Indonesia, but it's the growth and the access to the Chinese market. And so how they actually even made that acquisition decision which you would think is a C-suite and certainly a board level decision. But the unintended consequences was that it was unsustainable palm oil. And that came back and bit the organization because they were saying that they were family owned. They were saying that they were green. They were looking at very environmentally friendly products and processes. But their M&A decision did not include those sorts of filters. And so thinking that M&As is one type of decision and impact and environmental impacts is a separate decision, it's not. It really is about the corporation rather than individual finance decisions or procurement decisions or product decisions. And so looking at it more holistically, I would say is the biggest surprise and more important than ever, as Lindsay was saying at the top of the questions, because Black Lives Matter is not just an HR and employee fix. Sorry. It is how we create products. It's how we market products. It's how we source decisions. It's how we talk about who's important, how they're important.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Jen.
All right, sorry.
No, Avi, did you want to raise your question? I thought it was a great one.
Yeah, thank you. So my question is, how can individuals as employees, as consumers, as community members, identify companies that are in that win-win quadrant and support them? And then how do we encourage the companies that aren't there yet to do the work to get in that win-win versus investment? And I think pernicious CSR is my new favorite term.
Yeah, that word actually was stolen from The Economist in 2005. So that has been around, believe it or not, for some time. But to actually put it in place as something that truly is pernicious, that we think we are, but we're actually not. The answer to your question, Avi, is ask questions. And that's in part what ESG, particularly ESG and investments, is doing, is what are the environmental, the social, or the governance activities, as well as the impacts. If you're within an organization and you're entry level or even mid-manager, asking why we do what we do, and then thinking through the consequences, not just the intended, but also the unintended consequences of how it might affect others. And so for me, social responsibility, it's about people. How is it that we impact people? And those people might be our fellow colleagues as employees. It might be our customers, it might be our bosses, but it also might be broader than that. So asking questions, but also you as a consumer. COVID, for example, has been a great opportunity, at least for me and my family, to really look at the local neighborhood and visit D'Amato's and visit Cozy's, which is another family owned and operated business. But how is it that you are using your consumer dollars? And that's one of the strongest arguments that businesses always say, well, the consumers want the product, and so I'm just providing a product that consumers want. Well, how is it that you make those decisions? And if that information is available at a fair price, is that something that you would choose an organization or a product because that information is available? Because I think that those QR codes and where things are sourced, certainly it's happening in cocoa, certainly it's happening and has been happening, for example, with tobacco or drinks, is what are the implications of what we're doing? So everyday decisions. How do you do what you do? Do you understand how things were made? And it's that, it is really those let 1,000 flowers bloom rather than the large multinational corporates. So go back to that imagery of it's every decision, every business has that opportunity, every individual has that opportunity.
Jen, I wonder if I could, oh, did someone speak up?
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, but you know, we've just kind of been at the threshold of this idea that we have to have a bigger purpose than just making the best widget, right? That we really want to, the way we do stuff is actually creating good for our people, our communities, all that stuff. And that, you know, we'll have faith that we're going to still make enough money to be alive for another 100 years or so. And so it's just, we've started out with the board level. I'm the chair of the board now, and my other cousin who's on the board is here, and the other cousin is the head of our foundation, our new foundation. So, but we sort of have started at this level, trying to get the family involved with this idea of higher purpose. But then I'd like to hear from either you or the knowledge you have about from other companies where you really just get that so that everybody in the organization feels part of that purpose and is really just saying we're part of something bigger that's making the world better.
And it's that being part of something bigger that makes the world better on an everyday, every decision is where family businesses, I would say, William and Bill and Jane Bullock, I see you're here as well, and there might be others as well that are on this call. But it's family businesses, particularly long-term, multi-generational family businesses, have a one-up. And I've written and continue to write, and am fascinated at the opportunities, the unique opportunities that family-owned, operated businesses have over every other organization, particularly in this space, because you do stand for something. Yes, you need to have the money. It has to be an ongoing for-profit organization. You want it to survive generation after generation. And that's what corporate impacts is about, is you want to have that money priming the pump and building it out. But how is it then that you use those resources for some greater purpose? And it might be survival. And certainly with COVID, it was a lot about survival. But how is it that you can extend that more purposefully, not just in the giveaway of the money, which is important and incredibly impactful, but how you make the money, William, as you said. So how is it that you hire and train? And family businesses have this down in ways that other businesses do not. And I'm still learning an awful lot. So I've got an awful lot to learn from you. But the products and the services that you have, and then that halo effect, because you are known as a family business, that people come back and work with you, and you're able to use those relationships as a critical resource. And so I think family businesses are the untapped space that can really teach the rest of us about how to appropriately, creatively, very different than what is in the textbooks, think about corporate impacts. But then, as is often the case, and this comes from recent research that I've done too, is that large businesses will talk. So they have an action gap. They will do a comms game. But smaller businesses, once they get activated, once they're a catalyst and their eyes are open and say, let's enter into this impact space, they do so many different things and engage in so many different ways to experiment and to pivot, but it's not communicated. So smaller firms often have a communications gap. Larger firms often have the action gap. And so to hear more of your voice and to hear more of both the family businesses as well as small and medium-sized organizations, I think makes all of us better, because it's not in the textbooks.
Absolutely. Amy, did you want to jump in with your question? I think you'll be our last one for the day.
Yeah, hi. I was just trying to knit some stuff together with everybody. So as creating a larger impact, how we want to create it can be done by small individual decisions as well as C-suite decisions. How do you bridge that gap, Jen?
Very carefully. And that's one of the most important gaps, is because it's the rhetoric and reality. And so things might be happening very impactful at the ground level, but not up at the C-suite. Or the C-suite might be touting a lot of communications and rhetoric, but it's not actually happening. And that's one of the key aspects is that rhetoric and reality dynamic? Are there gaps between that? Because it's the employees, quite rightly and quite honestly, if they don't buy the rhetoric, if they don't buy the comms talk, then the organization's already on the back foot. And so building that credibility inside and having employees as ambassadors, not just contract workers or just, you know, in and out, whomever, but really transitioning towards an ambassador perspective that they are proud to work for the organization and they tout it. What an important, incredible opportunity. But the rhetoric reality gap, you're absolutely right. If they're not talking the talk and walking the walk, you know, gigs up as far as I'm concerned. It's going to be a short-lived sort of one-off activity. And that's where, for example, nonprofits can help fill that gap because they often have the deep local knowledge, so they understand if an organization makes a claim about we're good for the community or we're good for society or we're good for this neighborhood. It's the nonprofits that might do the measurement or the metrics or the accountability or really give truth to that. The nonprofits also are the third-party advocates that say, oh, well, this is just a hiccup. This is a good company that's having a hiccup. You know, look at all these other things that they have done and done well. And that's a credibility argument when, you know, things are going to go sideways. Things are going to go pear-shaped. And so to have those third-party advocates and to have meaningful collaborations and not just those transactional collaborations is really an important aspect, a role of nonprofits. I saw that question. And so I just wanted to take that into your answering me.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
Yeah, Shaw, did you want to jump in? I saw that you pinged something in the chat, so I want to give you the opportunity with the last couple minutes we have here.
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer. And you started to touch on the question that I had. My entire career pretty much has been in education and now in the nonprofit space. And it seems like sometimes we get a singular focus, you know, paralysis, for lack of better words. And my question was centering around how do we as the nonprofits become more practitioners of the work? Because we're often the recipients of the funding and we, just like you said, we're the arms connected to the community. But we also have the opportunity to do that corporate social responsibility work as the organization that's separate from the cause that we service.
Right. So you're the trusted third party. And you're also that bridge between the rhetoric that corporations might be talking about and the reality of on the ground with the community. And so you're an important bridge or broker, trusted broker, if you will, between both the community and the corporate, and which puts you either in the squeeze game or the sweet spot. And how then it's not working the two ends against the middle, but how is it that you actually bridge it and have that credible ampersand is really difficult. But that's also where, and I think to answer Seth's book, this is, I think, my next book is about the rise of civil society organizations, nonprofits, foundations that are truly moving the world, whether it's the Ellen MacArthur and the Bill and Gates Foundation or the local on the ground, deeply entrenched community organizations that are able to broker the corporate speak and the community needs. Because whereas before people were rubbing shoulders and going to the same little league or football pitch or whatever it was together, that's not happening anymore. And so we now need to have these trusted brokers to say, well, hang on a second. And that's where the funding mechanisms get convoluted a bit, because who then is, who owns the nonprofit, or if it is just about its mission, or is it about its funding? But those are the challenges that nonprofits and corporations have all the time too. I don't know if I answer your question there, but you're at that sweet spot or that messy middle. And it's how you bridge the two to make it double down and work for both sides, and everyone involved is a key aspect.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. We are getting close to time here. Jen, did you have any closing remarks before we let everyone go here?
Just thank you. Really appreciate your questions and comments and look forward to continuing the conversations because there's a lot of work to be done, but it's going to be done by you and it's going to be done by our children and our children's children. So I'm actually quite hopeful. But I also read the headlines and I know that there's that parade of horribles, but I also know that there's an awful lot of organizations that are doing wonderful things, and to hear more about those stories and how they're able to pull it off, quote unquote, or to make what seems to be or purported to be impossible possible. There's just a lot of inspiration stories and we're just not hearing it. So I want to hear those 1,000 trees growing, and it starts with you.
Absolutely. What a great place to end on. Thank you all for being here. We are recording the session, so keep an eye out for any distribution when we distribute the different videos of different sessions, and looking forward to seeing you all at the further power chats, discussions, and speakers over the course of the conference. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thanks, Jen.